January 12, 1995. Lamar Valley, in the northwest corner of Yellowstone. The temperature had dropped well below zero in the nights before. The valley floor was white and still. The Lamar River cut a wide, shallow channel through the flats, running between banks that had been losing their grip for decades. You could see it even from a distance. Banks that should have been held by roots were soft and crumbled at the edges. The channel wandered. In places it had split into braids, running thin and scattered across ground it should have cut through in a single line. Down in those flats, elk stood in the open. 50 of them. 100. They moved when they wanted and grazed where they chose, and had done so, in one form or another, for 69 years without anything above them in the food chain to change that calculation. And 14 wolves sat in transport crates, loaded onto trucks, after a long journey south from Alberta. That's all they brought. 14 animals into 2 million acres of land that hadn't seen their kind since 1926. At least, that's what everyone thought mattered. The number, the arrival, the politics of getting it done. Nobody was running models on the rivers, but this story doesn't start with those crates. It starts with what the land became in the 70 years before they were opened. The last confirmed wolf in Yellowstone was shot in 1926, shot deliberately as part of a predator control program that ran across the American West for decades. The logic was straightforward. Wolves killed livestock, competed with hunters for elk, threatened ranching operations. So they were eliminated, systematically, across most of their range. What followed was not the stable elk population that anyone had predicted. What followed was what always follows when the top of a food chain is removed. The elk grew in number, but behavior, not population, was the story. Without anything to fear in the open valley bottoms, the elk stopped moving. They had no reason to avoid the flat ground near rivers and streams, where the forage was easy and the grazing was good. So they stayed. Season after season, year after year, herd after herd, they stripped the willows and aspens and cottonwoods from every accessible stream bank in the park. They waded into the shallows and ate what grew at the water's edge, because nothing pressured them to leave. The willows were gone from the areas that elk preferred, stripped bare and gone. Walk the bank of a healthy mountain stream in July, and you step through a thicket of growth. Willows press in from either side, their branches trailing in the current, their roots webbing the soil below the waterline. The shade keeps the water cool. The fallen leaves feed invertebrates. The branches catch debris and hold it. Even in winter, the dead stalks of last year's growth stand thick enough to slow the wind off the river. Walk a bank that elk have stripped, and you are standing on bare dirt. Crumbled, compacted, undercut. The bank face above the water is raw. Nothing holds it when the water rises. Whatever grew there is gone. Beavers need willows. They eat them. They build with them. They depend on them for survival through winter. As the willows declined, so did the beavers. By the decades following wolf removal, Yellowstone's beaver population had collapsed in much of the park. The dams rotted out. The ponds drained. Streams that would have been slowed and deepened by beaver activity ran free instead. Fast, shallow, warm. And the rivers spread. Without root systems gripping the banks, erosion accelerated. Spring floods cut wide, braided channels instead of deep single ones. The banks slumped into the current. The water warmed without shade. Cutthroat trout populations dropped in sections where they had once been dense. The streamside songbird habitat, the canopy that willow and cottonwood provided, thinned and then largely vanished in the most overbrowsed stretches. Biologists documented all of it. Reports were written. Hunting seasons were adjusted. Supplemental feeding programs came and went. The land was managed the way it was possible to manage it without the piece that was missing. Nothing changed at scale. The behavior of the elk didn't change because the conditions that drove the behavior hadn't changed. You can reduce a herd's numbers with hunting. You cannot make a prey animal afraid of open ground through hunting pressure alone. That requires something that hunts differently. Something that waits in cover. Something that uses terrain. Something the elk can smell before they can see. There's a reason this story is still talked about today. The decision to bring wolves back to Yellowstone was not made quickly. It took years. Ranchers in Montana and Wyoming organized against it. Some wildlife managers argued that the ecosystem had found a new equilibrium without wolves and should be left alone. Federal agencies navigated decades of competing interests. There were environmental reviews and lawsuits and public comment periods. The Endangered Species Act was the legal vehicle that ultimately made reintroduction possible, but it required sustained political will at the federal level to move it forward. The 14 wolves that arrived in January 1995 had been trapped in Alberta and British Columbia. They were held in acclimation pens in Lamar Valley for about 10 weeks before the first group was released into the park in March. A second wave of 17 wolves followed in 1996. The opposition had predictions. The wolves would devastate elk numbers. They would cross park boundaries and destroy livestock operations. The experiment would collapse in political failure within a few years. Some elk were killed. Some cattle were taken near the boundary. The predicted scale of destruction did not materialize. The park's elk population did decline over the years following reintroduction. That was expected. What the opposition's models had not accounted for was the spatial dimension of the effect. Not just fewer elk, but differently distributed elk. Elk that moved. Elk that changed their patterns based on where the wolves were. That spatial shift was the mechanism that drove everything that followed, and it wasn't in anyone's model in 1995. But the land wasn't done yet. Far from it. The first change that mattered was spatial. The elk were still in the park, still in the thousands, but they were no longer standing in the same places. Within the first year of reintroduction, field researchers began noticing something that the models hadn't been built to measure. The herds were moving differently. They were avoiding certain areas, particularly the open valley bottoms and the stream corridors, in ways they hadn't before. Not because they were being killed in large numbers there, but because wolves used those places to hunt. The elk had learned, or relearned, what those open, low areas meant. Ecologists call this the ecology of fear. The predator doesn't have to kill every animal it encounters to change how the prey population behaves. It only has to be present. The mere fact of the wolf's existence in the ecosystem rearranged how tens of thousands of elk made daily decisions about where to stand and where to eat. An elk grazing in a meadow is an elk exposed. It is standing in the open, away from cover, focused on the ground in front of it rather than the terrain around it. A wolf ambushes from cover. It uses the willows, the creek bends, the broken ground. An elk that has lived with wolves knows what open meadows near rivers cost. An elk that has not lived with them has forgotten. Field teams tracking individual elk found that movement patterns shifted measurably in the first 2 years of reintroduction, concentrated in the drainages where wolves had established territories. The animals were present in large numbers. They were making different choices about where to stand and when. It is worth pausing on this, because it runs against the way many people think about predator-prey systems. The intuitive model is population math. Wolves eat elk. Elk numbers drop. Elk leave fewer footprints on the landscape. That is part of what happened. But the behavioral effect preceded the demographic one. The grazing pressure on streambank vegetation eased while the elk population was still in the thousands. The elk had simply moved. Within a few years, willows began regrowing along creek banks and river margins throughout much of the park. Slowly and unevenly. But the trajectory had reversed. Everything was in place. Nobody knew yet what it was building toward. When willows come back, beavers follow. That follows from food supply and habitat availability. Beaver populations in Yellowstone, which had been functionally absent from large portions of the drainage system, began recovering as willows re-established in the early 2000s. Researchers documented beaver activity in stream corridors that had been without it for years. There is a particular quality to a stretch of stream that beavers have worked. The water runs clear above the dam. The pond spreads back into the willows, and the willows spread back into the pond, each one making space for the other. Where the stream emerges below the dam, it runs through sorted gravel, the fine silt having settled out upstream. The bank on either side is dense with root growth, held firm by the constant moisture. But this wasn't just about beaver numbers anymore. A beaver dam does something to a stream that nothing else does. It slows the water. When water slows, it spreads laterally into the surrounding ground instead of running straight through. The water table rises in the surrounding land. Ground that stays wet longer can support more plant life. More plant life means more insects. More insects means more birds. Wider, shallower flows above the dam create wetland habitat where there was none. Below the dam, the water runs cleaner, cooler, with more dissolved oxygen. Up to this point, researchers had been watching a predator-prey story. It was about to become something else entirely. The willows and cottonwoods coming back along the riverbanks did something that no management intervention had been able to replicate. Their roots gripped the banks. Root systems hold soil. They interlock underground. They resist the hydraulic pressure of spring floods. They anchor the material of the bank against the current. When the willows were absent, the banks were loose silt and gravel, and every high water season cut them wider. As the willows returned, the roots held. The channels stopped spreading. In some drainages, they began to narrow. Researchers looking at the data noticed that certain streams in the park were measurably different than they had been decades earlier. Narrower, deeper, more stable. Sections that had been wide, braided, and shallow were running in single channels with undercut banks and shaded pools. That's not a typo. The wolves changed the physical shape of the rivers. Rivers are not static features. They shift continuously in response to the material of their banks, the velocity of their flow, the vegetation that anchors or releases the soil beside them. Yellowstone's rivers had been shifting in one direction for 70 years, wider, shallower, warmer, less stable. The wolf reintroduction bent that curve back. The technical term for this is geomorphological change. The form of the land itself altered, without any dramatic geological cause, because wolves created conditions that allowed plants to grow, that held soil that changed where water ran. And the timing of what happened next? Almost too perfect. As the streams deepened and cooled and their banks stabilized, the cutthroat trout came back into sections where they had been sparse. Pools cold enough for spawning, deep enough for cover, clear enough for feeding. Bald eagles began hunting those stretches with more regularity. Songbirds returned to nest in the willow and cottonwood canopy, species that hadn't nested in those corridors in years. Grizzly bears found the serviceberries and chokecherries coming back on the hillsides above the streams, shrubs that grow alongside willows and had been absent where the willows were. The carcasses left by wolf kills became nutrient deposits in places they hadn't been before. Ravens and coyotes worked them. The remains fed the soil. By the early 2000s, researchers were documenting something no one had put in the original models: a ripple effect that ran from the highest predator in the food chain to the path that rivers cut through the valley floor. A cascade that touched almost every component of the ecosystem. The same wolves that opponents said would unravel the region had, in ways nobody anticipated, begun to rebuild it. Which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. The decision those federal officials made to bring them back. The outcome wasn't guaranteed. The models didn't predict the rivers. Nobody voted for geomorphological change. I want to be careful here. Yellowstone has specific conditions that made this cascade possible. A 2 million acre federally protected landscape with no livestock grazing in its core, no human infrastructure in the riparian zones, and enough contiguous habitat for wolves to function as wolves actually function. Those conditions are not common. The cascade happened here, in this specific context, at this specific scale. What the story proves is something narrower and more durable. It proves that predators are structural. That word is doing a lot of work. Wildlife management tends to treat predators as a check on prey populations. They are that, but they are also something that shapes the entire spatial organization of an ecosystem. What happens here, what gets eaten here, what grows here, who can live here. Remove that organizing presence, and the ecosystem doesn't just lose a check, it loses a shape. Predators don't just remove individuals from a prey population, they change the spatial behavior of that population. They determine where prey animals stand, where they eat, where they don't go. Remove the predator and the prey fills every available space. Put it back, and the prey reorganizes around the fear of it. That reorganization, in Yellowstone, ran all the way down to where the rivers ran. I spent 34 years watching this country try to heal itself. Most of what I know, I learned by standing still. What I learned from reading what the researchers documented after 1995 is this: ecosystems are not simple enough to lose one piece and stay the same everywhere else. The wolf was not a decorative part of Yellowstone, it was a load-bearing wall. That January morning in Lamar Valley, the river was wide and the banks were bare, and the elk stood in the open without a second thought. These days, the willows are back along that stretch. The banks hold. The river runs deeper in a narrower channel. Go there now and you find a valley that has come back. 14 wolves made it that way. I'd have bet against it. If stories like this one are what you're looking for, subscribe. And if there's a place near you that came back, a stretch of land or water that surprised you by recovering, leave it in the comments. Those are the ones I'm trying to keep track of.